and super excited to welcome you all in this afternoon. We've got a very great webinar ahead with Dr. Tanya Harris and Dr. Joan Mascaro. We're going to talk about saving Earth, saving Mars. I can't wait for this conversation. A couple of things we just want to remind you about is that we've had some great success with the offering that we're doing in partnership with Explore Mars, the Janet's Planet Online Astronaut Academy. Today was epic. We had Wally Funk of Mercury 13. She was just stupendous. Feel free to go to either Explore Mars YouTube or Janet's Planet YouTube and watch the replay. She will certainly inspire. And truly, that's what this whole time has been about, whether we're doing it for the young or for whatever age of a space lover you may be, that we want to provide great programming that not only lifts our spirits, but gives us hope for the future. And there are multiple ways that we want to honor you and continue to offer this to you. If you've already given some level of support, Dr. Fred, I know you have, so thank you. Many of others of you here on this call today have also given generously. If you see so fit and would like to make a gift or a donation to Explore Mars, that certainly helps us to keep bringing great programs like this to you. But as always, we are here to serve you, our wonderful advocates, our wonderful fellow Martians, to advance space, but to also advance humanity. So thank you guys so much for joining us this afternoon. And without further ado, I give you Dr. Tanya Harrison and Dr. Joan Mascaro, who are going to blow your minds this afternoon with some great information. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jen. It's good to be here.
So just for a quick breakdown of a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. With the development of private commercial aerospace innovations, the chances of humans traveling to Mars in the near future are increasing, but only a tiny fraction of the 7.8 billion people presently living on Earth will ever travel to Mars. And the effort could arguably be a distraction from the very real problems of climate change, food security, and energy we all face collectively. Education, inspiration, and technological development are obvious benefits of a Martian voyage, with technology arguably being the most immediately practical. We will consider how specific technological innovations needed for the earliest Mars missions will materially help fight climate change on Earth. Creativity, imagination, and an ability to work in groups make humans an extraordinary species. How can we leverage these abilities to help the other species on Earth as well as our own? So today, our two guests are going to be in conversation about these very topics. First, we do have Dr. Joan Mascaro. He is a tropical ecologist and remote sensing scientist. He is the Director of Education and Research Programs in Planet and an honorary research associate at the University of Oxford Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, where he is studying the evolution of technology in the Anthropocene. Joe's work has appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Nature, Science, and many, many other publications. So Joe, thank you so much for coming and joining us today.
Thanks, Ron. It's really exciting to be here.
And next up, the one and only Dr. Tanya Harrison. Dr. Tanya Harrison is the manager of science programs at Planet Federal, the federal government arm of Planet Labs. She is also a professional Martian, having spent the last decade working in mission operations for NASA's Mars orbiter and rovers. She holds a PhD in geology with a specialization in planetary science and exploration from the University of Western Ontario, a master's in earth and environmental science from Wesleyan University, and a BSc in physics and astronomy from the University of Washington. Tanya is also an avid science communicator, having made appearances on TV, radio, and podcasts around the world. You can find her prolifically tweeting about space, Mars, and inclusion in STEM on Twitter as Tanya of Mars. Both of you, thank you so much for coming today, and we are excited to hear this conversation.
Whoop. Thanks for having me. Sorry, got some mute problems there. So I guess to kick things off, Joe, do you want to talk a little bit more about your background and specifically how you got interested in climate change and why, as an ecologist, you're interested in Mars at all?
Sure. So, when I was pretty young, I was really interested in tropical forests. I think a lot of nature documentaries as a kid. But I was also, I wanted to be an astronaut. I was totally one of those kids who wanted to go to space. And when I was very young, the Challenger disaster occurred, and so I was pretty affected by that. but I definitely tended toward wanting to work in the field and being outdoors. And so I kind of started to set my path down the ecology lane. But I kept following space. I was following the shuttle launches. I was following the early construction of the International Space Station, which was really compelling to me. And I remember my ecology friends at the time were not terribly interested in it, to put it mildly. So it's sort of like a kind of a personal interest. And then things started to change a little bit in two ways. I came across The Case for Mars, of course, Bob Zubrin's great book about how we could alter the red planet and make it habitable, but also all of these sort of exciting ideas for how we might innovate, the very nature of our civilization by becoming multiplanetary. And so I got interested in that. And then around the same time, I started to notice that, and I think it's a fair argument that many of my ecologist colleagues and a lot of environmental scientists, sometimes would view space as a luxury. It's not to say they were against it, but they, definitely started to think of it as something that maybe ought to be deprioritized compared to the urgency that we have when we look at something like climate change, right? Which of course, 7.8 billion of us are affected by now, versus maybe only a handful of people that would ultimately go to Mars on a very expensive mission. But one of the things that I saw was a lot of the parallels in some of the challenges. When we start to think, especially fantastically, about altering the Martian climate, doing terraforming and making it habitable to us, we're really into a thought process about ecology, about sort of global ecology, right? We're talking about changing atmospheric chemistry. We're talking about changing global temperatures. In a lot of ways, we're literally talking about doing deliberate climate change on the Martian surface. And so I think I was really interested in the parallels between how we think about these two different climate systems. And then the other thing that happened to me that was kind of interesting was, it's difficult to remember. My earliest memory of being aware of anthropogenic climate change on Earth, human-caused climate change, was like a friend in 6th or 7th grade saying to me that, I wouldn't go to Florida because it's going to be underwater in 10 years or something along those lines. And I was like, that doesn't quite sound right. I think it's natural to be skeptical that the climate system is changing. And I had that experience as well. And so I started really diving into the science of climate, mostly as an undergraduate and then especially in grad school. And where I really got excited was learning about the long-term natural history of climate change on Earth. So, of course, we have this 4.6 billion year record of a highly complicated climate system. We had a change from a reducing atmosphere to an oxygenating atmosphere. We had the radiation of animals and plant organisms and their effects on all these various climactic subcomponents. And it wasn't until I understood this sort of historical natural climactic context that the human-caused climate change began to seem so clear and obvious to me. And I think that a lot of that was planetary science. It really is planetary science when you look at the whole Earth system and try to understand that climate variation. So Tanya, let me put the same question back to you. So you are also a person who's crossed in both worlds of obviously being a Mars scientist, but studying some terrestrial ecosystems, and especially with glaciers and now with planets. So how did you end up touching both of these worlds?
I guess I started on Mars and came the other direction, sort of. I had always been interested in Mars specifically, but when I went to school, like when I started college, I thought, well, Mars is in space, I should be an astronomer. And it was not clear to me until about my junior year as an undergrad that I actually should have been a geologist instead. But I didn't want to spend a bunch of money to stay at the university another year to change my major to geology. So instead, I looked around and tried to figure out, were there any geology classes that sounded interesting to me to kind of see if that's what I wanted to do before I made the change in grad school to geology, or maybe stayed in astronomy. And the only class that sounded interesting that was available the quarter I needed to try and take something was a class on glaciology, so focusing on glaciers and snow. And I was completely fascinated by that class, learning how glaciers flow and move and how they behave in different areas. I knew that climate change was a thing. I knew that there was human-caused climate change and there was natural-caused climate change, but actually understanding how this was affecting glaciers around the world from a physical standpoint got me really interested in this. And I ended up switching my focus a little bit. I've been working on like star clusters as an astronomer to working on glacier dynamics on Earth, and then glaciology on Earth as a proxy for things that we see on Mars. So in some places, at least when I was in school, we didn't know if there were these places on Mars that still had ice outside of the polar regions. And eventually we found with instruments that came along a few years later, there was still ice hiding in these things. And so I had been interested in how climate change was affecting glaciers on Earth, but also how very long-term climate change on Mars had affected the distribution of ice across its surface as well.
So I know you and I have talked about this quite a bit, but one of the things I've been working on a little bit, and you've been working on, is trying to understand general patterns about technology. So obviously, when we talk about a mission to Mars, I think it's really important to think about it in the near term, because as it relates to Earth's environment, to climate change, the immediate effects, if any, of a Mars program, I think might even be felt by those earliest missions, but the ones that we can imagine, because they would run on the technology that we more or less have today. And so, you and I have talked about this from the perspective of how does technology happen at all? There's kind of a sense among a lot of people, and I had this sense too, that inventors, sort of an inventor behind an imaginary desk in an imaginary lab are behind a lot of inventions. And that they're essentially solving the problem that's right in front of them, right? So they're innovating within a lane and trying to come up with a solution to a problem. But a lot of the technology literature and the experience that we live in aerospace now suggests that that's not really the case at all. So we could look at something like the steam engine, which certainly was not innovated with the forethought of building railroad networks or some of its other pervasive influences on our economy as a civilization. And one example has nothing to do with space, but I think it's a good one because it's not biased. It doesn't have our preconceived notions about climate change or space, is to think about GPUs, about graphics processing units. So like when I was growing up, I remember these as graphics cards, right? You would modify a computer to make the video games look better. And so the GPU really came about due to now a multi-billion-dollar economy around innovating a new type of processor. But today, we use GPUs to power autonomous vehicles like self-driving cars. They're in medical diagnostics. And so when I started, And so when I started looking at even the basics for a Mars mission, go back to a Zubrin Mars Direct approach, look at some of the modern Starship architecture that's coming together with SpaceX, or New Glenn over at Blue Origin. There's some interesting trends that ironically are very climate relevant. So critically, both Blue Origin and SpaceX have moved into methane liquid oxygen propellant. So the Raptor engine and the BE-4 engine are methane and LOX powered. And this of course suggests that their intention is to do in situ propellant production on Mars, where basically they would take Martian CO2 out of the Martian atmosphere and do some chemistry to get methane and oxygen, right, which they could liquefy as propellants to return to Earth. And as a Earth scientist, when I look at that, I see carbon capture and sequestration. I mean, it is literally a climate change mitigation technology. It is sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it into liquid form. There are definitely some differences in how you might approach that because of the CO2 differences between Mars and Earth. But I wonder what your thoughts are on the fact that we see basically a space innovation pipeline around what you might call a carbon mitigation technology.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. To me, I tend to think about innovation for space in terms of the playground that it provides to us. It's something where you're no longer so constrained in the things that you can propose that you want to do. And so some of these things might be very practical, like what you're talking about, carbon capture. The technology that they're proposing to use for this on Mars is not anything new. I mean, a lot of this involves stuff like the Sabatier process, which we use a lot here on Earth. On the Mars 2020 rover, there's an instrument that they're going to be launching called the Mars Oxygen In Situ Explorer. I always forget what the whole acronym is. but they're going to be testing for the first time in situ resource utilization on Mars with this tech demo. So this is an instrument on the Perseverance rover, which launches in July. It's about the size of a car battery, and it's going to bring in CO2 from the Martian atmosphere. And through not a Sabatier process, but a different type of electrolysis, it's going to bring in that CO2, rip off oxygen, and kind of dispel everything else, and measure how much they're able to generate over time, over the course of a couple hours each time they run this instrument, and then put it back into the Martian atmosphere. So a very simple experiment just to make sure that it works before they invest more technology in trying to do this on Mars. But it's completely applicable to things that we would want to do here on Earth. It's applicable to creating life support systems that they use on things like the space station. But when you think about technology innovation for bigger things that we need to do on Mars or in space in general, you start thinking about things like water reclamation and other things that involve sustainability, food packaging, medical supplies. You know, what are you going to do in a place where you don't have access to fossil fuels or petroleum to make a lot of plastics and things like that? So when you try to think of solutions in these areas on Earth, you're really constrained by what you encounter in your day-to-day life. And the example I like to toss out there is dealing with something, let's say water shortage in a place like Phoenix. If you propose an idea to take care of that, it needs to be something that feels very realistic to the people that you're proposing this to, because if it's too outlandish, they're going to throw that idea out the window and say you're crazy. But if you take that same problem and package it in terms of space, suddenly you're not so constrained in terms of what you are allowed to propose creatively speaking. And so it's also just a more fun thing for your mind to imagine for a lot of people, right? Like, I mean, maybe there are people out there that dream about what they can do to reclaim water in the desert in Arizona. But I think it's more exciting to take that in terms of Mars when you're thinking about it. So we can use space as a way to get people excited and innovate inside of a smaller parameter space, but a larger thought bubble in terms of what is possible. And I think that's really what space offers us in terms of technological development here.
Yeah, I think this is such a cool point, and really I think maybe the one that we wanted to talk about the most today. Like, and let me say it back to you to see if I understand it too. Like, basically, when somebody is innovating or solving a problem, there's a degree to which they might, of course, be creative. They might look for solutions outside their own discipline. They might look for solutions in their own discipline in front of them. But it seems to be a common element in the space industry that because it's space, there's a certain amount of permission giving, that imagining perhaps a fantastical or creative solution is something that in the space industry people tend to do, indeed are trained to do. There's sort of a natural inclination to do it. But then there's also paradoxically, living on the Martian surface in a habitat, again, even for the first mission, or dealing with some of the challenges in flight to go to Mars, you also have this sort of countervailing force of an extremely tight constraint that is the engineering reality of doing it has a lot of pretty serious red flags, right? Like a vacuum en route to Mars and some of the radiation environment on the Martian surface. We could come up with a kind of an endless list. So you're on the one hand given a lot of permission to think creatively, but on the other hand, really, really tightly constrained with respect to how you think about the weight of a piece of technology you innovate or various other factors. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's something that almost is helping you hone that creativity as opposed to working in a more constrained environment in terms of creativity on Earth, but maybe your parameter space is a little bit bigger.
And so, you and I talked about some other areas. Let's look at, again, first Mars mission. So let's imagine something realistic with modern technology. We're talking maybe 4 to 6 people. We're talking about potentially a habitat on the surface, probably a return vehicle on the surface. And so if you're putting this mission together, what kinds of technologies, in terms of what you're eating, how you're generating power, whether with solar panels or RTGs, how you're dealing with potentially manufacturing some kind of new component you might need to deal with a new situation. How, would you say that these technologies that you're working with are climate relevant? That is to say that they're relevant to the energy problem or carbon dioxide emission problem that we're dealing with climate change on Earth.
Can you hear me now? Okay, yeah, everything froze there for a second. Sorry. Can you repeat the last thing you said, Joe? It cut out for me.
Yeah, I was just looking at like a constellation of technologies that you might take with you to deal with mission one. You know, how climate relevant would you consider them in terms of when you look at things like end panels, nuclear technology, the various agriculture technologies that you might be exploring? Obviously,
Yeah, I think everything that you're thinking about is going to play some role in addressing things that contribute to climate change here on Earth. One of the biggest things that we have to deal with anywhere in space is power. And power is something that we take for granted so easily here on Earth. I mean, we have batteries all over the place. You can turn on your light switch and power everything in your house, and it's not a problem. And a lot of that might be coming from places like hydroelectric power. Mars doesn't have any water. It might be coming from coal plants. Mars doesn't have any coal. It might be coming from some form of fossil fuel. Don't have any of that on Mars either. So when you're looking at Mars, your options really are solar power or nuclear power. And you're going to have to make things like more efficient solar panels. You'll want to make solar panels that can handle the harsh environment of being on the surface. And that's completely applicable to trying to make smaller, cheaper, more efficient solar panels here on Earth so people can use them in their day-to-day lives. NASA really helped bring down the cost of solar panels early on, because when they were initially developed, the price was astronomical, no pun intended. And so it wasn't something that was really adopted very quickly, but then NASA started using it on satellites, and by some accounts kind of helped keeps the solar panel industry going until it reached the point where they could start using it in things like homes. So it's actually 15 years between the first satellite where NASA used solar power to the first time that solar power was actually implemented in a home. And now, I mean, the house I live in has solar panels on the top of it. They're pretty widely available. Food is another really big aspect. You're going to have to feed all of these people. And as we all learned, hopefully from The Martian, you can't just bring all of that with you. You're going to need some way to keep people healthy and survive. They're going to need fresh vegetables. They need to have a diet that they're going to want to eat and is nutritionally complete. And that applies to things here on Earth. We have a growing population. Our population is supposed to expand by 2 billion people over the next few decades. And at some point, we're going to have to double the amount of food that we produce. And we have to figure out how we're going to feed people in different areas of the world, different climates, different soil types, and creating more efficient farming mechanisms, potentially genetically engineering more nutritious food, learning how to do better hydroponic and aeroponic growing practices. And we might talk about some of that stuff in specifics a little bit later. And then, like you said, the carbon capture technology. If they're going to actually generate their fuel on the surface of Mars to get home versus bringing it all with them, we're going to have to figure out how to do all of that oxygen generation and methane generation on the surface. And then that applies to carbon capture technologies here on the Earth. And those byproducts that come out of it are totally applicable to things here as well. There's a life support system that Honeywell Aerospace has developed for the space station that pulls out the CO2, creates breathable oxygen, and creates these carbon bricks as a side product. And you can use them in things like power lines and airplane brakes, and possibly even construction material because they're so hardy. So there's a lot of side benefits to all this technology that's created for space, but we can totally use it here on Earth.
Yeah, I think as an ecologist, I'm really interested in some of the agriculture, potentially genetic engineering we might be talking about for different kinds of crops. And it's pretty interesting to look at it from an ecological stress perspective, right? Mars is obviously very cold, very dry. There's, I think, a lot of open questions about the abundance of perchlorates in the soil, but certainly other types of salts that are in the soil. I should call it regolith. We don't know if it's soil. Ecologists reserve that word for living soil with organisms in it. But I think when we go to Mars, again, even early missions, experimenting with growing food in these types of regolith or soil that have a set of stresses that are very specific, right? Creates an interesting innovation space. And the parallels with the types of food security, genetic engineering work underway right now to deal with adaptation to novel climate environments things like saltwater intrusion. So one of the concerns for a lot of earth-based agriculture is that the extraction of fresh water from the groundwater leads to saltwater intruding from the marine areas, depending on how far away you are from the coast. Another really interesting one. So if I can do a brief bit of plant evolution, most plants are C3 plants. They use a particular photosynthetic pathway called C3. But around sort of 30 million years ago, I don't know precisely, we started to see novel photosynthesis strategies in plants. And a lot of people would know succulents, for example. If you keep houseplants that are succulents, they use a novel photosynthesis strategy called CAM. And one of the things that this strategy does is it helps deal with very arid environments, or it helps deal with water management. So basically when the plants are opening their stomata to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which they use as food, they lose water. And so CAM is one of these adaptations that helps plants deal with that. And it seems from the evolutionary record that the result, or the cause of the appearance of these novel photosynthesis strategies was a gradual reduction in carbon dioxide concentrations in Earth's atmosphere that happened especially around the Miocene period. So in a sense, plants were pushed, and I'm going to anthropomorphize evolution, so I have to be careful, but plants were pushed into a new innovation space, and they increasingly and repeatedly stumbled upon a lot of the same metabolic strategies for dealing with that new climate. And so it's interesting to consider how humans will manipulate different types of plants when they get to Mars, because we're going to have to sort of engineer or configure these plants to deal with these novel Martian environments. And I see the possibility of co-opting those innovations for terrestrial crops to be really high potential.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. We talked a little bit about investments in climate remediation technology and monitoring climate change here on Earth from people that are involved in space activities like Jeff Bezos. And like, as an ecologist, what do you think about that side of things?
I think it's a really interesting development. A few years ago, I did a sort of back of the envelope look at carbon emissions from rockets, and they're not zero. Most modern rockets are burning RP1, rocket grade kerosene, and so there's a CO2 emission from that, and there's a huge amount of particulate exhaust from that. So there are some cleaner burning strategies. If you do methane and LOX, you have more complete combustion. You don't have the particulates, but you still have a big CO2 emission because you're basically just oxidizing a bunch of methane. And so, but at the same time, the number of rocket launches per year, give or take 100, is so low that this is a very, very minor part of carbon emissions worldwide. It's many orders of magnitude lower than air travel, for example. So one of my big questions is how companies like Blue and SpaceX, and maybe even NASA, will begin to deal with, an increasing number of rocket flights will make those emissions higher, potentially. And so I am interested to learn whether, Bezos and Musk and other leadership have ideas about how they might mitigate those carbon emissions, because I would speculate that rockets are a very minor carbon emission right now, but they're a very noticeable one.
Yeah, for sure. And I was curious when we were talking about this the other night, where the move toward methane engines came from, because it's not a new idea, but we're seeing it gain popularity, like you said, between Blue Origin and SpaceX. And so I reached out to a friend of ours who is a rocket engineer to ask kind of the history of this and why it was gaining popularity right now. And this actually tied again back into the idea of Mars benefiting us here on Earth. The popularity of this with SpaceX came directly from Bob Zubrin talking to Elon Musk from his designs for the case for Mars. And so that has tied into a lot of the stuff that SpaceX is trying to do. So taken from Mars to be used here on Earth for, again, that long-term goal of getting back to Mars. That doesn't really tie into why Bezos wants to use methane. There are some pros and cons to using methane as a propellant for, his goals for lunar stuff. But I thought it was interesting to have that tie back to Mars and Zubrin as well.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's not a one-to-one analogy to look at sucking CO2 versus Earth atmosphere. I think the technological innovation question we have to ask ourselves is, are we fostering creativity by having engineers, chemists, atmospheric scientists go into a new thought problem of how they would manipulate Martian atmospheric chemistry and these various propellants? And what's the probability that them innovating in this different or novel way compared to these terrestrial challenges might result in new ideas that might not have otherwise been considered? And so, of course, we don't want to predict the future, but I think the probability that we learn some interesting things about atmospheric chemistry, manipulation of CO2 and methane in these types of novel environments seems pretty high. And then there's the probability that those innovations flow back through these communities that do a mix of both. Of course, you're friends with some engineers who work on CO2 mitigation on board the International Space Station. And that's actually much more analogous to CO2 capture on the terrestrial atmosphere, because of course the CO2 level on the space station is much closer to the CO2 level on Earth than the CO2 concentration on Mars.
So kind of tying back to the very beginning of what you just said there, you're talking about how we can get these folks like chemists and atmospheric scientists to start innovating in this space. This is also an area where there's a lot of room for transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, whatever buzzword you want to use for it, collaboration in these areas to work toward innovations. And we've seen some really interesting examples of that in the space industry, both coming into it and coming out of it. And some of those especially relevant right now with things that have been happening with response to COVID-19. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the ventilator stuff that we were chatting about the other day?
Yeah, so I think some of you watching might have seen a couple of stories about both a NASA team and I think a Virgin Orbit team working on a novel ventilator system. I think designed, it's my understanding, which is limited, is designed to be a bit of a short-term stopgap technology. So not quite exactly a replacement for a pretty standard hospital ventilator, which might cost $40,000 to $50,000, but something that can, first of all, be built relatively cheaply, relatively quickly, and be scaled relatively quickly. And what really caught my eye is that one of these teams started by, according to a journalist, walking across the street to AutoZone to buy a windshield wiper motor. In biology, if you're thinking about how things evolve from a biological perspective, we tend to think in terms of adaptations, right? So you experience evolutionary selection pressure for a trait. And actually out of the biology literature, this sort of new term came about, or instead of we say adaptation, you might say that there's been an acceptation. And it's a bit of a cumbersome word, but the distinction is about which problem is it that you're trying to solve, or which piece are you using? So in this case of these engineers walking across the street to AutoZone, they're taking an off-the-shelf technological component, and anybody working in the new space industry, off-the-shelf technology should sound very familiar, since almost every company in new space is doing it and using that type of approach. So you take this existing technology, it might not be a perfect fit, but you've recognized it as something that solves your immediate problem. And in biology, it's fair to call this an acceptation. You used a solution which was designed for other purposes, but for a new purpose. And what really fascinates me is thinking about what kinds of steps or strategies could we take to encourage that type of behavior. I think it's definitely the case that the more vibrant communication is, the more cross-disciplinary the communication is, the higher probability it is that, for instance, a self-driving car engineer is going to see the parallels in a GPU graphics processing unit chip for a problem that they're trying to solve, just as an example. And I think in the case of these ventilators, that's the kind of thing we're seeing, which is a new space engineering strategy of co-opting existing off-the-shelf technologies and putting them into other purposes. And I thought that was a really compelling story about some of the action that's being taken with the current COVID crisis.
I think we're seeing a move and a recognition as well from the funding bodies for work like this, how important this interdisciplinary work is. There have been some calls recently from certain programs like through the National Science Foundation. There's a particular call called Navigating the New Arctic, which is all about understanding how the Arctic here on Earth is changing due to climate change. Of course, the wording is written in a very politically correct way right now so that it can get through the current political climate. But the call in there specifically asks for interdisciplinary research. It wants geologists working with social scientists, working with atmospheric scientists to look at all of these things together, because there are so many moving parts in this system. And I'm glad that there's a recognition like moving toward that, because we have been so siloed off. And so researchers over here probably have no idea what researchers over here are doing. And it could even be two different departments in the same university or two different areas at NASA. I've seen this multiple times where you have different groups at NASA working on identical projects, and they either don't really talk to each other, or they were completely unaware of what was going on one side versus the other. And that's not bashing NASA at all. If they have 20,000 employees, there's a ton of different centers all over the country. It's hard to keep track of what's going on, but trying to increase the dialogue between different groups so that they know what's happening and maybe start thinking about stuff outside of their box. Somebody working on the AutoZone side of things with that windshield wiper motor, would they have thought of something like that for the medical industry? Or would they have thought about how something like that could apply to a Mars rover? Who knows? But if they didn't know what kind of options were out there and what the space is that they need to innovate within, that idea might never come to them in the first place. And so I would really love to see people thinking about how to take the knowledge that they've gained in their field and how it can be applied to other things to benefit more people.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, we're about 40 minutes into this, so I wondered maybe we could wrap up with a few thoughts and then start to switch over to questions. I had one question for you, and it might be a little contrived, Tanya. So I know that NASA publishes periodically a report about space technologies called spin-offs. And you and I were talking about this a little bit in advance, but what's your take on that report? Is there something that NASA could do to better socialize the nature of the way that technology might be flowing on both out, from the space industry or into the space industry?
I feel like that's such an important question. And the easy answer is putting it out in the form of a PDF that hardly anybody is going to read is not sufficient. There are so many things that NASA does that benefits our lives every single day, and it just kind of goes unrecognized. But if those things were gone, we would notice it very quickly. So I don't know if it's a matter of changing the terminology or giving better funding to the STEM education office so that they have more power behind them to get out there in front of the taxpayers. This is what your money is actually doing, and this is how it's directly benefiting you in your day-to-day life. I don't want to give any of the answers that we talked about last night because I don't want to steal what I know you want to say on this topic. But I will say that what Joe has in terms of opinions on this matter, he was able to convince me of by the time our conversation was done. So,
indeed, this is a bit of a canard since obviously we prepped this in advance, but Tanya and I were talking about the word spin-off itself. So the word spin-off itself has a number of definitions, but one of them is, incidental or derivative. It's sort of less than, right? Like that it's sort of a happy accident, but clearly not a priority. And I think when you look back at the history of innovation and the history of technology, one of the things that seems to be true about it is that it's very rare that inventors or innovators completely foresee the utility of novel technologies. Edison, who's famous for inventing the phonograph, among many other inventions, was adamant that the purpose of the phonograph, the record, was for dictation. He envisioned it as something we would use to capture minutes at meetings, even in the early 1900s, and was not particularly psyched about it being used in jukeboxes, which is how it eventually became popular and ultimately led to this entire modern music industry that we have. Something like the PET scan, right? So the medical PET scan is positron emissions. I think it's tomology or tomography. But a PET scan is an outgrowth of particle physics and don't think any particle physicist would say that that's incidental, that is sort of like a happy accident or a spin-off. In many ways, doing particle physics is about understanding the nature of our world. And there's forethought that any potential technological innovation may come out of that, and that those are, in a sense, always unforeseen in this way, that sometimes it proceeds without forethought. So I definitely think that's an interesting way to look at it, that the technological benefits of a Mars mission may be less about, things like, things that you would consider spin-offs, and more about the nature of innovation itself. Are you driving innovators to solve really complex, very constrained, very difficult problems? And how are you pushing their creativity to explore this design space? And asking what things can you do to encourage the probability that any innovations they may come up with are communicated and enriched, so that the 7.8 billion of us that will likely not go to Mars can benefit from them in the form of dealing with some of these climatic challenges we talked about today. So
I think I think the understanding that we have to take away from it is there is a demonstrated history of the space program producing things that are integral to our daily lives as we live them, but we don't necessarily know what those are going into it. And so we can't necessarily sit down and do an economic survey of how a Mars mission is directly going to benefit humans technologically here on Earth. But I think we need to have faith that we know there will be things that come out of it that we can't possibly predict now because we haven't had to think about them yet. And so we should really keep this in mind as we're thinking about what we're going to do to innovate as we move toward Mars. So our questions have been handily collated into a spreadsheet for us.
I know, I'm looking at it. There's quite a diversity.
Let's see. I like the first question on the list for you, so I'm going to pose that one to you. Tapa Sweeney, who is 17 years old and lives in India, wants to know if we can try terraforming the Earth before we do so to Mars.
It's such a great question. And of course, the word terraforming tends to be used in the context of modifying other planetary bodies to make them more like the Earth. It also implies foresight, right? Deliberate intent. And I would say, one of the great thinkers on this specific issue recently is David Grinspoon, who was at the Library of Congress as an astrobiologist, and he's written a recent book. I confess I can't think of the title off the top of my head right now, but it deals with this particular issue about basically, humanity has had a dramatic and far-reaching impact on the ecosystems throughout the Earth, including the whole ecosphere. We've altered maybe 50% of the land surface. We've altered the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. We've had dramatic alterations in the nitrogen cycle. No ecosystem, even the most remote ecosystem, is unaffected. But it's also fair to say that we've done much of that without purpose. In other words, it was not our deliberate conscious intent to damage Earth's ecosystem. And Grinspoon is advocating for a kind of cognizance of intervention, that when we do planetary scale intervention, that we think about it through a terraforming type lens, which is, it is our intention to modify the climate of the Earth in the sense of a real physical problem of the gases in the atmosphere and the temperature of the atmosphere, to make it not only resemble what it did prior to the Industrial Revolution in terms of lowering CO2 concentrations, but make it a less stressful environment for the ecosystems on Earth. And so I absolutely think we can think about terraforming in the context of Earth. I would say, should we do it before we go to Mars? I think one of the things we're trying to say today is that I think we shouldn't treat these as mutually exclusive. The amount of money that's going to be spent on going to Mars, even in a huge Mars mission scenario, is tiny compared to the amount of being spent on the climate problem. So I don't think you have to worry about a huge asymmetry in terms of funding Mars missions versus conserving the Earth. And I do think we can do both, and we should. Oh, so I'm glancing at some questions for Tanya. So give me a moment because I'm browsing through these. But oh, this is interesting. Okay, actually, it's also from Tapta Sweeney, but I didn't notice that right away. But I'm going to ask this one anyway because it's a really good question. Can we try to combine machine learning and remote sensing to get future predictions of natural disasters? It's definitely a good Earth systems question for the present moment.
Yeah, there are definitely teams at NASA and at universities that are working on this right now. Some of it is working on automated detection. So after something has happened, like a landslide, they can detect in the images sort of taken before and after that occurs, they can see where it's happened. Or they'll get a call from someone on the ground that says a landslide had happened, and they can go through and map these things out. But the goal is not to be just responding after they happen, right? We want to be able to predict these things before they happen. And so the more that we study them after they've happened, and the longer record that we have of all sorts of remote sensing observations. So we have optical images, we have thermal images, we have radar, LiDAR, all sorts of data at this point from tons of different satellites in orbit. We can combine all of those over a huge time stack to try to better understand what causes these things, or what are the cues that we could start to look at. I'm biased toward landslides because that's my area of expertise. So you can try to look at things like, when is that mass of stuff that's going to fall down a hill starting to detach from the hill? Or in the case of maybe something like a hurricane, what are some of the factors that we can look at in the atmosphere to give us better clues earlier on about how strong it's going to be and the path it's going to take, so that we can try to move people to safer areas as early as possible, and make sure that we have first responder efforts lined up if it's something where we know people are going to be affected and we don't have a way to get them all out of the damage area. So instead, we can make sure we have everything prepared to be, on the ground for them when it happens. And machine learning is going to be the biggest way to do that, because we have so much data to work with at this point. It's at a level where, we can't just send armies of grad students to pour through it anymore. So I'm looking forward to, in the next few years, huge advancements in this area. Go back to the list of questions for Joe.
I'm looking at that one from Dr. Fred Bortz, which looks pretty cool. I don't want to hat tip too hard. You can, of course, browse through there yourself too.
Yeah, we'll go with that one. It says, a practical concern. This is a really good one. You're right. Getting political support is terribly important for doing this. Do you think inspiring people by talking about transforming Mars will enable public buy-in to support climate change mitigation on Earth?
I think it is a great question. And interestingly, I think human space exploration, at least in my personal political experience in the United States, has been a relatively apolitical activity. But it's worth looking at the origins, right? So of course, we have to remember the Apollo program took place during the height of the Cold War. An interesting bit of political thought, one of the most popular pieces of diplomacy over the last few years, especially in Washington, D.C., has been this concept about soft power, which is a diplomatic process by which, in a non-militaristic way, you inspire other cultures and governments to trust your transformational force in the world. And so one of the ways you do this is through education. For example, being a very attractive educator with an incredible higher education system is an expression of soft power. And bizarrely, this soft power was not understood, or at least the author who coined this term did not talk about the space program at all. not Apollo. Apollo escapes mention in the first discussions of soft power. And I took that to mean that the author and the political class thinks of Apollo in some ways rightly as a quasi-military program. And of course, there are technological components of it that were militaristic, but a lot of the way that it was executed at the highest levels of the White House, it had a very clear Cold War footing type agenda. But the other consequence of Apollo, and potentially one that was not really anticipated, was this, of course, this huge emotional experience. And Tanya, you've written about this recently, and I'd like you to talk about this too. But the huge emotional global experience that we had was seeing the Earth from space for the first time. And it kicked off years worth of incredible emotional discussion about the way that we value our natural world. The Earthrise photo is one of the most widely published photographs. And when you look at why do people republish the Earthrise photo, it's usually to talk about the Earth, not to talk about the space program. And this perceptual shift led to a number of things. We had some revisions to the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act that were passed very quickly after Apollo. The Environmental Protection Agency was created very shortly after Apollo. The first Earth Day was in 1970, so right on the heels of Apollo. And other leaders have talked about this. I don't think that's an accident. A lot of planetary systems thinking had its origins in the space program, the early days of the space program in the US, and the early days of environmental thought. In many ways, there were a lot of the same people in the same worlds. Carl Sagan, a perfect example. And so I absolutely think, and it's just me guessing, but I think when we start seeing humans leave low Earth orbit for the first time since the 70s, there is likely to be a global conversation about that. And that is to say, a global media, a global political conversation about it. And I don't think we can anticipate what that conversation will look like, but it's difficult to imagine that it won't also rekindle some of this overview effect, some of this emotional development that we experience by thinking about the way that our planet appears in the blackness of space. So I don't know, again, I know you've just published a book on this very topic, so maybe you have some thoughts on this too, Tanya.
Yeah, so this might be a long thought tying into that, but part of it came to mind as you were mentioning how Earthrise put Earth in context for a lot of humans. So not to sound self-promotional, but yes, I just published a book called For All Humankind, where me and my co-author, Danny Bednar, interviewed people from around the world who watched or listened to the Apollo landing live as it happened, but did so from outside of the United States. So this was to get a non-American perspective on this moment in human history that often gets painted with a very patriotic lens. And the universal response from people, and this ranged from, at the time of the landing, people that were, there was a 5-year-old girl in rural India, all the way to a 44-year-old Holocaust survivor from Lithuania. And universally, the responses from people were that they felt like this was something that they were a part of, even if they had no connection to America, no connection to the space program whatsoever. This was a human achievement that brought a lot of people together in a way that the world has never really seen. And one of the things that got me a little bit depressed, actually, in the process of writing this book and afterward, was that I thought the world can never come together like this again. We're so distracted by all the different things that are going on in our world and our lives that I had this pessimistic thought of, well, even if humans do go back to the moon, or when they do go to Mars, it will be just a blip on the 24-hour news cycle and then it will be forgotten. But I might have just been overly pessimistic in that moment. And then it hit me, watching all the things that have happened during the response to COVID, actually, I was wondering, what is going to be our next Apollo moment? What is that thing that will bring us all together? And I went from having this negative thought of, we will never have that again, we're just not societally able to do that, to realizing that the response to COVID and the things that we're seeing in terms of the changes in our climate might be our next Apollo moment. A lot of parts of the world are coming together in ways that we have not seen in a long time, rallying together to make face masks and gather medical supplies, go grocery shopping for your elderly neighbors. I have friends that check on me to see how I'm doing that I haven't heard from in ages. And like seeing how people are working to try and take care of each other and address this issue is really refreshing. But then on top of that, I think the things that we're able to see from space, from all these satellites that we have in orbit, from NASA and the European Space Agency and other commercial providers, we're able to have another Earthrise type moment where people can so clearly see the way that humans are impacting the Earth and the climate by the reductions in pollution that we're seeing over areas due to the shutdowns. And so maybe this is another moment in history where we're actually going to get a better idea of humans in the context of the Earth system and realize that these aren't two separate things. Humans are part of nature. We are all in this together, and all of these pieces are interconnected.
I am looking at a few questions that I want to throw your way. I did want to mention Bill Gardner is talking about Neil deGrasse Tyson's recent book called Accessory to War, which deals with the relationship between the military and the space program, and especially the space industry, but also going back to the early days of space technology like telescopes. And I certainly wanted to add a +1 there, that it's a really compelling book, and I think one of his best in terms of it deals a lot with these types of technology transfers. So I just wanted to mention that. But there's a question getting a little more into the details of MOXIE, and I think this one is really interesting. So the question is, and this is from Don, and I'm sorry, I might mispronounce the name, Don Hayaduik. Would the Mars 2020 rover experiment MOXIE work on Earth? Mars has a 95% CO2 atmosphere, but much lower density compared to Earth, which has about a 0.04% CO2, but at a higher density. That is, the whole atmospheric density is higher. I think it's a really good question. I think we could break it down in two ways. Like, I know that the Sabatier reaction, which actually, I'm sorry, is not part of the MOXIE experiment. Let me throw this question to you, Tanya. You're the Mars expert. Do you think you could run MOXIE on Earth, in other words, with the CO2 level that we have on Earth?
I'm not an expert on the MOXIE experiment, so that is the caveat to this. The process that MOXIE uses is a solid oxide electrolysis process, and there's no reason that that shouldn't work on Earth. But there could be some specifics about the design of MOXIE in particular that might make it not work on Earth in terms, like I said, of the density. There's also some special filtration systems built into MOXIE to deal with the fact that the Martian atmosphere is really, really dusty. Actually, I shouldn't even call them special. They're literally just HEPA filters. So we sent some HEPA filters to Mars on the rover so it'll breathe a little bit easier. So again, taking technology and applying it to another planet, but maybe we'll learn something about how the HEPA filter functions on MOXIE that influences how filters are designed in the future on Mars in dusty places like the outback of Australia or Phoenix during haboob season. So yeah, I don't see any reason why you couldn't use it unless there was some physical redesign that you need to do to deal with the differences in the Martian atmosphere versus the Earth atmosphere. But the solid oxide electrolysis itself, there's nothing complicated about that would make it different between the two planets that I know of.
Yeah, in a terrestrial context, and I'm not an expert in this particular area of atmospheric chemistry. Of course, there are some companies working on development of novel direct air capture, CO2 air capture technologies. One of them is called Carbon Engineering, and I believe it's up in Seattle. And the system approach to that is going to be quite a bit different than the in-situ propellant production for something like MOXIE. But obviously, the parallels are in terms of what is the particular innovation, what are the particular subcomponents of a technology. And both of these are like active research areas. And so I think we can easily imagine some cross collaboration between those types of groups.
So we've talked a lot about technological innovation, and there's another great question here in the column for you from Andrew Planet, looking more at conservation ideas. And this also ties into climate change here on Earth, producing less waste. If human habits on Mars are going to be insular and therefore inhabitants have to be very thoughtful on what resources they use and how much, should we manage resources on Earth in the same way? I think the answer is absolutely, but maybe you can give a more in-depth answer than that.
No, I think it's a fantastic question. And this relates to our brief discussion of the Apollo era and the early dawn of kind of modern environmentalism. I don't think there's any question that experiential learning of doing a real Mars mission, of being in transit to Mars for several months, being on the surface of Mars for maybe 500 days, being in transit back, all in incredibly confined spaces, all with incredibly stringent and rigid resource requirements, is going to create a picture of resource constraint that is in some ways totally and utterly new for most people in the world. And I think having a dialogue about that, about how you use technology or can use technology to deal with incredibly stringent resource requirements, is potentially one of the best experiential learnings that might come out of a Mars mission. So yeah, I think absolutely, but I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. Obviously, we can't predict what will happen. I'm looking at a few. I did want to mention. Thank you. Fred Borta has noted that Grinspoon's book is called Earth in Human Hands, and thank you. I'd forgotten the title, so I did want to mention Grinspoon's title, Earth in Human Hands. Definitely worth reading. I see another question from Tapa Sweeney, and I think we should talk about this because it's a really good question, and I don't know if we totally know the answer. But the question is, did Milankovitch theory validate climate change? What do you think about that, Tanya? You're obviously working with glaciers. Milankovitch was sort of your bread and butter.
I mean, I think it helped us be able to pull apart the idea of human-caused components of climate change versus the larger scale natural cycles of how the climate has changed on Earth. So we know that there have been multiple ice ages. Even very recently, we've had like the Little Ice Age, followed by the medieval warm period, and now we're in sort of this, I guess you could call it interglacial period. That's what we call them on Mars. Is that what do we call it that here?
Yeah, we call them that on Earth too. Interglacial.
Okay, sometimes I spend so much time on Mars, I forget what words we use on Earth anymore. I shouldn't admit that now that I work for an Earth observing company. But yeah, I think it was a really important piece of being able to pull those two things apart. We can very easily see the long-term patterns of how the climate has varied in the history of Earth. And there have been humans over time. We can trace back some of them to very specific events like large volcanic eruptions, large events like extinction events, the impact that wiped out the dinosaurs, for example. But the things that we see, the markers in the atmosphere that are happening right now from humankind, are very, very different and much more rapid than anything else that we've ever seen. I guess from an ecology standpoint, is there anything you could speak to, Joe, in terms of these cycles? Or the differences between what we see during Milankovitch cycles versus human-induced climate change?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of overlap. I mean, the first thing I wanted to say, some of you may be familiar with certain strategies of climate denialists. And one of the climate strategies that you sometimes use is, back in the 70s, scientists were talking about the next ice age. They were saying, oh, there's a coming ice age. And I've always found this to be quite amusing because it is true that there were articles in the 1970s about potentially future ice ages. One of the reasons that is true is because it was in the late 60s and the 70s that primarily through the deep sea drilling program, which is a program where we started putting in sediment cores in the abyssal plain of the ocean. This was really the first time that we began to have a comprehensive data set about some of the climate fluctuations that have happened over the last several million years, particularly the last 2.5 million years, during which time we've been in what terrestrial scientists would consider an ice house period. So this is a long period characterized by polar ice, which we're in now. But it's then within this ice house period that these sort of sinusoidal Milankovitch cycles are expressed, these cycles that affect the position of the Earth in space relative to the sun, the axial tilt of the Earth, and the sort of wobble of the Earth's axis. And I only had a brief kind of encounter with Milankovitch theory, but it was an intoxicating one because it helps you understand, that some of these signals come from isotopes and ice cores. Others of them come from foraminifera, which are tiny animals in the ocean, and then their shells are deposited in the abyssal plain in this rhythmic pattern over millennia. And so when we put those data sets together, there is a very clear very clear sinusoidal pattern of glacial, interglacial, glacial, interglacial, glacial, interglacial. And these are, oscillating on the order of every 100,000 years or so. And as Tanya just said, it is sort of through the lens of this Milankovitch kind of background natural climate variation that this modern anthropogenic human-caused climate variation is expressed. So the glacier interglacial cycle, you're dealing with a carbon dioxide concentration change of, roughly speaking, 280 ppm parts per million at the max and 200 parts per million at the low side. Roughly speaking, I don't have the exact numbers. Whereas now, with the Industrial Revolution, all the modern human emissions, CO2 has gone up all the way to, I think today it's about 415 parts per million. So we're, 120, 135 ppm higher than we were for any prior interglacial over the last 2.5 million years. And yeah, for me, getting into Milankovitch cycles was, I found it to be the best context setting that I've ever gotten for modern climate change. And I think it's one of the really cool phenomena that you can study to kind of put some sort of broad understanding around modern human-caused climate change. To wrap up the thread with the politics of it, why were scientists getting all excited about a forthcoming ice age or a future ice age in the 70s? It's because that's when we sort of finally connected the dots with these deep sea cores to understand this ice age, this sort of interglacial glacial cycle. And so as soon as everybody kind of began to understand the cycle, they looked at where we were in the cycle, which was a warm period, and said, oh shoot, we're probably going to go into a cold period in the future, which is true. The Earth's, it's just, it's something that will happen over tens, potentially 100,000 years, versus this modern human-caused climate change that's happening over, of course, every single year, every single day. Our CO2 emissions are going up.
So I see an interesting question. It's phrased as a statement, but I'll change it into a form of a question for you, Joe, from Patrick Getting. And he says that he thinks that the return on investment in terms of technological innovation for a mission to Mars won't be as great as it was in the Apollo era due to technological ceilings. And so is there a limit that we can gain based on the technological advancement that we are at right now versus the level of technology we had at Apollo that you think will limit the return on investment of a mission to Mars in terms of potential technology that we could use here on Earth for climate change?
Wow, that's such a cool question. And I'm definitely going to need some help from space history from you, Tanya, on this one. I suppose the question really is around, what do you consider the start of a Mars mission technology cycle? So if we look at SpaceX landing orbital rocket boosters on ocean drone platforms or back on landing pads at Cape Canaveral, I would consider that to be a technological outgrowth of a desire to do a Mars mission. And I don't think I'm reading between the lines when I look at that, that this is a technological component that SpaceX has desired to build as part of a very deliberate, very public desire to do Mars missions. One that Musk has said repeatedly is vital for having a sustainable approach to kind of Mars mission architectures. So I think we have some modern post-Apollo examples of those kinds of technologies already. I have never built rockets, and I wouldn't pretend to be a rocket scientist. So, anecdotally, I know that avionics improvements, essentially computer software improvements, have been vital to pull off something like that. And I also understand that there's a fair bit of manufacturing improvements in terms of ablative manufacturing or certain types of welding that are relatively new. And I think if you start to basket those all under technologies that have, at least in part, been driven by a desire to go to Mars, I think we're already talking about real technologies that exist now that have come about as a result of this Mars mission effort. Certainly, a lot of these modern technologies with respect to some of the private rocket companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin differ from technologies that we might have had in our grasp in the kind of shuttle era. But I don't know, Tanya, you probably have some thoughts on this question too.
I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. Falcon 9, for example, is not designed to go to Mars. It's never going to go to Mars, but it is designed as a piece of a larger architecture by SpaceX of their long-term goal to go to Mars. So I could definitely see the argument that that is a technological growth in terms of something related to a Mars program. I think part of it goes back to what we were saying earlier about that we don't know what we don't know. We can't predict all the things that will come out of trying to do this. And some of it is stuff that we're already doing on the space station. We just need to be able to do it better and for longer terms to be able to send humans all the way to Mars, and certainly to send humans to Mars to stay. And so I agree that there are technological ceilings, but I don't think we're anywhere near the maximum capability of what we could do. And like another part of Patrick's comment is basically saying like we might be a little overly optimistic because of science fiction, but a lot of innovation has also been driven by science fiction. There's a really great documentary, I think it's called How William Shatner Changed the World, and it's all about how technology that was showcased in Star Trek influenced real world innovations. And so, you know, we should keep having these crazy dreams in sci-fi because it pushes us to try to make these things real. We look at it and say, hey, this is cool. I want this to happen. So I think we can't fully grasp what we will actually get out of a Mars program in terms of technology.
You know, it's a good point that we didn't talk about as much today, Tanya. On the science fiction side, I think one of the really interesting elements of that is not so much to think about specific things that were imagined in science fiction, but to look at it through the lens of this this creative imagination, this sort of permission giving of working in space, right? If you day to day work on space technology, the probability of going into a lunchtime conversation and talking about a space elevator or something you might consider fantastical but plausible and taking it seriously is high. And this is not the case for a normal dinner party, certainly at least in the America I live in. If you start bringing up a space elevator, with your non-space friends, who knows where you land. So I think that sometimes we think about it from a brass tacks, like technology for technology. Can we make an antimatter engine the way that Star Trek has shown us? And perhaps a different way to think about it is, what material innovative benefits do we get out of fostering creative thinking? And what elements of creative thinking are fostered by other life experiences? And I'm particularly starting to learn more about modern neurobiology that might teach us some things about this. I think modern neuroscience is very interested in the nature of consciousness. How often do our dreams influence our creativity? And I think when we think about it through that lens, then clearly just having an imagination or having the stomach to have an imagination seems to be a material factor here in how innovative you might be.
I think that's a chronic problem with the space program, is that we recognize that creativity and innovation are two of the huge things that it provides society, but that is also nearly impossible to quantify. And that is a death knell for anything that's funded by the government, because they want statistics and they want numbers. And how do you say a mission to the moon 50 years ago inspired 15,000 people down the line to become rocket engineers in their career? You can't draw those direct lines, or if you can, the timelines are too long for it to really mean anything in the moment when this stuff is happening. So I don't know how we fix that.
I have a cool question for you here, Tanya, from Omar, and it is, up to what level of organic Martian biological complexity do we have to discover before we abandon the idea of terraforming Mars? So in other words, what kind of life might we discover on Mars, either extant or extinct, at which point you would reconsider modifying the planet?
I mean, if the life is extinct, I think there wouldn't be very much discussion about not altering the environment, because there's nothing there that you're protecting specifically. If there is life there, I mean, I'm going to take the pessimistic view of, look at how great we've been to life here on Earth. If it's a bacteria or something, microscopic, I have a feeling that in the long term, we won't treat it very well. We won't take very good steps to try and preserve it. Certainly, if the first people that go to Mars and stay there for an extended period of time end up being scientists, and you don't have access to Mars from other people for quite a while, which technologically and monetarily speaking, that's probably going to be the case for at least a little while. The scientists will definitely want to protect that as much as possible to really understand, what is this life? How is it different from life on Earth? How has it survived in these conditions on Mars that are so hostile to life as we know it? And really understand that, and then figure out, okay, how do we come to Mars without killing it? Or is there something that we have to worry about if we go there and that life ends up killing us? That's very unlikely, but something that we would want to take into account. And from a more optimistic standpoint, I would hope that we could learn something by the bad ways that exploration has been done on Earth historically, and we can maybe try to be better at it when we send humans to other planets, even if the life that we're encountering is microbial.
Yeah, I would just merely say that I think it's not necessarily a showstopper, but it's definitely a conversation stopper, right? Like even extinct life forms, microbial life forms from Mars would, I think, necessitate an enormous effort of biological discovery or paleontological discovery in order to incorporate into our biological understanding of life itself. This is obviously one of the great motivations behind having a space program at all. It's understanding not only some of the unique qualities of life on Earth, but exploring the possibility of life off the Earth. And so I think it changes everything, right? And I couldn't even begin to guess how that would unfold. We have definitely today biased our conversation toward technologies or realities that might be uncovered with early missions, but given the nature of the life-finding technology we've sent to Mars so far, obviously even those early missions have the probability of adding to this conversation.
And I think the interesting sort of tandem question coming at it from the other angle is, how much do you have to study Mars before you are convinced that Mars does not have or never had life? And that's probably an even harder question. It'll be easy to see, I think, at least on the surface, if Mars has life or not, or ever had life. It's really tricky to do with the rovers that we've sent so far, because they're covering such small areas and they can only get a little bit, underneath the dust and into the ground to see what's going on. And life is much more likely on Mars when it was more warmer and wetter, 3.5–4 billion years ago, which is probably going to involve going and drilling humongous cores like we've done here on the Earth. But even then, at what point do you say, okay, we're like 100% sure, or maybe you can never be 100% sure, we're 99% sure that there was never life on Mars? I don't know at what point you reach that before you decide to make that decision.
I think a good way to think about this is to look at how much we're still uncovering about the origins of life on Earth and some of the critical biological events that occurred throughout evolutionary history. Just in the last 20–25 years, our understanding of endosymbiosis, which is this process we think is responsible for the emergence of complex multicellular life on Earth. We had billions of years of single-celled prokaryotic life, followed by perhaps as few as one endosymbiosis event to give us mitochondria in our cells. And subsequent animal complex organisms, all subsequent organisms to that are from a single common endosymbiosis event. All of this is a relatively recent thing that we've learned about our own evolutionary history. And so I can't even suppose how we would parameterize how quickly we could learn about a yet unknown, if any, Martian evolutionary history.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Even though Mars is seemingly much more simplistic than the Earth in terms of its history, there's still so much that we don't know, and it's going to take a really long time after humans get there for us to really start to put together the pieces. Let's see if there's another question on this list I can ask you.
Can I pipe in just for a second? One that's just came in. Shiraz Ali says, can we talk a little bit about how we save Earth as well? Our current habitat in today's topic. But, we're talking a lot about technology and Mars, but it seems he's asking, what are these applications for Earth? What do we humans need to save our Earth? It's
a great question. I mean, it's probably even potentially a good wrap-up question. I mean, when we look at the scope, we really focus today on climate change. obviously there's a whole diversity of threats that ecosystems face, that humanity faces from all different aspects of our global ecosystem. I think that when you look at the climate system, the human alterations to it are enormous. But it's also, I've been struck by, in a sense, the engineer's brain on this, or sort of the engineering way to think about it, which is, if you think about it as a physical problem, which I think it's okay to do that, right? We have a CO2 concentration, a carbon dioxide concentration of 415 parts per million. If we were to bring that concentration down, back down closer to 350 or 380 parts per million, closer to where it was, shortly, a few decades after the Industrial Revolution. Actually, 380 is more like 1990 time period, but let's say 1990 for the sake of argument. Would we have solved the whole problem? No. There are other elements of it. There are aerosols. There are chlorofluorocarbons. There are a lot of pieces, but we would have absolutely arrested one of the principal concerns. And so I think what we're trying to say today is, what is the way in which we approach solving that physical problem? We have a huge amount of investment, all of it good, in reducing carbon emissions by increasing the sustainability of the way that we generate electricity, increasing the sustainability of our transportation through things like electric vehicles. But we also have this relatively modest segment of research and, in some cases, commercial companies that are built around capturing carbon dioxide in the air. And so, again, just as an example, we think the probability that there is some technological benefit yet not imagined out of researching manipulation of atmospheric chemistry on Mars is relevant to that question. That the probability that somebody stumbles on something important in terms of how you might do direct air capture on Earth is non-trivial. But I don't know, Tanya, maybe you have some kind of concluding thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the takeaway point that we're hoping you would have is that all of these technologies that we need to develop to go to Mars and survive there are things that can help us with climate change here on Earth. The things that we're going to use to draw carbon dioxide out of the Martian atmosphere and create oxygen and create rocket fuel are things that we can use as carbon capture and sequestration technology here on Earth to reduce the carbon dioxide levels in our own atmosphere. The types of things that we need to develop for more sustainable farming practices and healthier food can help deal with areas that might be experiencing famine here, or places where there are food supply issues, anything where you have places where the climate or the soil are being affected by all sorts of changes, increased salinity due to different processes that are going on, Joe mentioned earlier. Figuring out how to have more efficient power systems benefit us here on Earth in terms of more affordable to remote areas. Another area that we didn't even really touch on, because it doesn't address climate change, but the development of medical technologies to be used in space have a lot of applications for rural medical technology here on Earth and first responder efforts in places where people don't have access to hospitals. And so all of these things that we design for space are completely applicable to situations that we're dealing with here on Earth. And so you shouldn't think of these as two separate things. We're not just going to Mars and spending money that we could be using to spend solving these problems here on Earth. The money that we are spending on these things for Mars will also be things that are used here on Earth.
I think that is the perfect place to wrap up this conversation. I don't know about all of you, but I want to watch this about 3 more times and make sure that I am up to snuff on all of my geology, my theories. Again, Dr. Tanya, Dr. Joe, it is an immense honor to be in your presence, to have your good thoughts and intellect and explain them in such amazing ways. We cannot express enough our deep gratitude for you being here with us today. And a big shout out to my student, Tapaswini from India. I have known this darling girl since she was 12 years old. And I've got to tell you, as you guys were so kind to mention, she had such great questions. she's going to be my Nobel Prize winner. So Tapa Swinney, I know it's late where you are, so please get some sleep here in just a bit. But thank you guys so much. Coming up next week on our Explore Mars webinar at 1 p.m. Eastern next Thursday, will be all about Mars architecture. You don't want to miss this. They're going to be talking about all kinds of things and long poles that will get us eventually to Mars, making habitats and living there and exploring there. So that's next Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern. We want to thank everybody for your grand support and coming online. We here at Explore Mars are all about serving you, giving you something to think about. And we hope that Explore Mars, as we get humans to Mars and missions to Mars even more set in stone, that we will in some small way play a part in giving you your next Apollo Artemis moment. So everybody give a big virtual round of applause to our guest today, and we will sign up here. Thank you again, guys, so very much. Brilliant job.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. It was
Awesome.
so great to be here. Learned a lot. Appreciate it.
Oh, you guys, I learned a lot. Like I said, I'm going to go back and re-listen to it. Thank you, guys. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. We'll be back here next week. Stay safe and live long and prosper. My new COVID-19 best handshake here. Bye, guys.
Bye.